You've been lied to about loyalty, not in the small way where someone breaks a promise and apologizes, in the deep way, the way that rewrites everything you thought you understood about power, obedience, and what happens when the most feared organization in human history decides that its creator has become its greatest threat. The SS were not just soldiers. They were the ideological spine of the Third Reich. They were the ones who ran the camps, enforced the terror, and swore a personal oath, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to the military, but to Adolf Hitler himself, to his name, his person, his survival. That oath was written in blood and recited with the kind of fervor that psychologists today would have difficulty separating from religious devotion. So what happens when those men, the truest believers in the room, begin to turn? The story most people know about plots against Hitler begins and ends with July 20th, 1944. The bomb, the briefcase, Klaus von Stauffenberg, the explosion that failed to kill the man it was meant to destroy. That story is real, and it matters, but it is only the surface. Underneath it, something stranger was forming, something the history books tend to skip past. A slow, creeping realization among the very architects of Nazi terror that their Führer was leading them all into the grave. This is not a story about one assassination attempt. This is the story of what happens when loyalty becomes a trap. Heinrich Himmler understood power before almost anyone else in the Reich. He had built the SS from a small personal bodyguard into a parallel state, an empire within an empire, with its own army, its own economy, its own intelligence apparatus, and its own concentration camp network. Historian Richard Evans, in his landmark trilogy on the Third Reich, describes Himmler as someone who combined bureaucratic obsession with ideological fanaticism in a way that made him uniquely dangerous. He did not act on impulse. He calculated. By 1944, the calculations were not adding up. The Eastern Front had been hemorrhaging German soldiers for 3 years. Stalingrad had taken an entire army. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy. Inside the Reich, cities were being reduced to rubble by Allied bombing campaigns that the Luftwaffe could no longer effectively answer. And at the center of it all, Adolf Hitler was making military decisions that his generals watched with a horror they were forbidden to speak aloud. Himmler watched too. And he began quietly to explore alternatives. The first thing you need to understand about SS disloyalty is that it did not look like disloyalty. It looked like caution. It looked like contingency planning. The men who began to pull away from Hitler's orbit did not stand up and announce their defection. They whispered. They met in secret. They sent intermediaries. They used the language of loyalty as a mask for the quiet mechanics of self-preservation. Walter Schellenberg, the head of the SS Foreign Intelligence Service, was among the earliest to begin back-channel communication with the Allies. Historian Katrin Paler, in her study of the wartime intelligence world, documents how Schellenberg attempted to use Swedish intermediaries to signal that elements of the SS leadership were prepared to negotiate, not for Germany's survival, for their own. That distinction matters. It tells you something true about what the SS was by 1944. It had never been an institution built on Germany. It had been built on Hitler. And when Hitler became a liability rather than an asset, the loyalty that had seemed unbreakable turned out to have been conditional all along. Himmler's own transformation is the most extraordinary part of the story. In 1945, as Soviet forces tightened around Berlin and the Reich contracted by the hour, Himmler authorized a series of meetings that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He met with Norbert Masur, a representative of the World Jewish Congress, in April 1945. The man who had overseen the Holocaust, who had walked through Auschwitz and given orders that resulted in the deaths of millions, sat across a table from a Jewish representative and attempted to present himself as a moderate, as someone the Allies could work with, as someone who had in some way been a restraining force. The audacity of that performance is almost impossible to absorb. And then came the moment that finished him. On April 23, 1945, Himmler met with Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat, and made an extraordinary offer. He proposed a German surrender on the Western Front, specifically to the Western Allies, while fighting continued against the Soviet Union. He framed it as a pragmatic solution. He framed it, one imagines, as statesmanship. He did not tell Hitler. When the BBC broadcast news of the contact on April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's death, The Führer's reaction was described by eyewitnesses inside the bunker as one of the most violent rages of the entire war. Historian Ian Kershaw, in his definitive biography of Hitler, describes the moment as a point of psychological rupture. The man who had been the most loyal, who had run the most feared institution in the Reich, had gone behind his back to negotiate with the enemy. Hitler stripped Himmler of all his positions. He ordered his arrest. The man in charge of the SS had been declared a traitor by the SS's own creator. But Himmler was not the only one. He was simply the highest ranking. All across the Reich in those final months, SS commanders made independent decisions. They slowed deportations in ways that were never officially sanctioned. Some destroyed records, some allowed prisoners to escape who were supposed to be executed. Historian Robert Gellatili, in his work on Nazi coercion and consent, notes that the machinery of the Holocaust did not simply stop because people developed a conscience. What happened was more complicated. The men who had run it began to calculate their post-war identities. They started thinking about how things would look, what evidence would survive, what they could claim they hadn't known. That is not redemption, but it is a form of turning, a slow, self-interested rotation away from the man they had sworn their lives to. There is a concept in political science called the dictator's dilemma. The idea, developed by political theorist Ronald Weintraub in his 1998 analysis of authoritarian regimes, is that the more a dictator suppresses dissent, the less accurate his information becomes. He surrounds himself with people who tell him what he wants to hear. He creates loyalty through fear. But fear-based loyalty is the most fragile kind. The people around a dictator are always calculating whether loyalty or betrayal is the better survival strategy. And the moment the dictator begins to lose, the calculation shifts. By April 1945, Hitler had lost. Everyone around him could see it. The men who had built the SS on his behalf had spent years building something they now needed to preserve without him, and so they turned. The final irony is this. The SS was designed to make betrayal impossible. The oath to Hitler personally was meant to foreclose any space between the organization and the man. The uniform, the rituals, the ideological indoctrination, the blood symbolism, all of it was constructed to bind men so completely that the idea of acting against Hitler would feel like acting against themselves. And it worked, right up until it didn't. Because the thing about absolute loyalty is that it is never actually about the person you are loyal to. It is about what that person represents, what they make possible, what they protect. When Hitler stopped making victory possible and started making survival impossible, the loyalty broke not because the men had changed, but because the calculation they had always been running, unconsciously beneath the surface of their devotion, finally came up with a different answer. Tonight you will probably keep a promise you made to someone. You'll do it without thinking about it. Because trust feels like the right thing, and because betraying it feels like betraying yourself. That feeling is real, but it has a price. And somewhere in the ruins of a collapsed empire, in the whispered meetings and the silent record burning, and the secret negotiations of men who had sworn their lives to a monster, you can see exactly what that price looks like when the one you swore yourself to finally stops being worth it. The most dangerous loyalty was never the one that broke loudly. It was the one that bent quietly in the dark when no one was watching. And by the time the world found out it had broken, the men who broke it were already planning how to survive the aftermath. That is the story the SS never wanted told. The night they turned, it didn't happen in one night at all.